So this is the 2026. This is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And at the library, we are doing a series of programs called We the People 250. This is the first program in that series, but we'll be doing programming all year. It's going to be focusing on both national history and local history, as well as like civics and government, so we can kind of just all celebrate America. A few of our upcoming programs. On Tuesday, we've got an evening with Paul Lisnek. That's a Zoom program. He's going to be talking about the state of Illinois politics. And then in a few weeks, in February, we're doing the Declaration of Independence, Just What Does It Say? And that'll be another hybrid program. No, Paul will not be here. It's a Zoom program. Yep, so that'll be all virtual. Okay, but yeah, for tonight's program, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement since we are celebrating our 250th anniversary. So I'll just read this. As we mark the 250th anniversary of the United States, we acknowledge that in 1776, and for generations before and since, the land where Glenview Public Library stands was and is the homeland of Indigenous peoples. This region has been primarily inhabited by the Potawatomi, the Ho-Chunk, and the Sauk-and-Meskwaki or Sauk-and-Fox nations. And it is also the traditional homeland of the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Miami, and the Oceti-Sakowin. As a civic institution whose core values include inclusion and perpetual learning, we honor their enduring presence, heritage, and contributions, and invite you to learn more about the histories and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples who have called and continue to call this land home. So we will discuss some Indigenous history tonight. The subtitle of tonight's program says that we'll focus on the 1800s, but I do want to start a little before that so you can understand why European and American settlement happened in the region when it did. So to get started with that, this is the Great Lakes region. Obviously, these are Indigenous water routes that were used in the Great Lakes region from about 1600 to 1830. The people that you see listed here, these are all the Indigenous populations that were in this region. This is where they were located in about 1750. So archaeological evidence and Native American oral tradition indicate that the Great Lakes region had long been a center of trade and communication between the Great Plains, the Hudson Bay, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico. So there were various languages spoken throughout the Great Lakes region, but there were common dialects which allowed for easy travel and trade between nations. And you can see a lot of the tribes that I just mentioned here. So the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Miami, you've got the Ho-Chunk and the Sauk here, the Sauk-and-Meskwaki or Sauk-and-Fox tribes here. So the low watershed of the Chicago area, it often flooded during rainy seasons, and so like in the spring and fall, and this facilitated canoe travel throughout the region. So portages and river junctions became the sites of trading posts and villages. Northern Illinois was also well suited for intensive agricultural practices, so corn and squash and beans were primary crops. Tobacco and rice would also be grown. Bison were plentiful in the region, and some tribes were attracted to the area for their yearly hunts. So the Dakota, which is another name for the Oceti-Sakowin, they would come here for hunting season. Other tribes would come here for winter. So you had groups like the Ottawa and the Ojibwe. They would come down here for winter because we're warmer than Canada and Michigan, at least most of the time. So there would be different tribes living together in the same village and camp here. But the two major things when you think about this Great Lakes region were very important for travel, for commerce, for connecting different regions of the country, and we're also strong in agriculture. So those are the two reasons why people want to live here, right? So French exploration, this area was French territory. The French began exploring North America a little late, not until the mid-1500s, but they didn't establish permanent settlements until the early 1600s. They integrated themselves with indigenous nations to learn about trails and waterways. The French officially began exploring southern Lake Michigan in the 1670s. So Marquette and Joliet, they arrived at the mouth of the Chicago River in 1673. But we know that individual entrepreneurs known as coureurs de bois, or wood runners, they had already began exploring and trading in the region. They often intermarried and they lived amongst the native tribes. And they were here beginning in the mid 1600s. So Marquette and Joliet, we know that they explored the north branch of the Chicago River, and they also went up what's now Milwaukee Avenue. I don't know how far they came up, but it is possible that they came to the Glenview region and explored here. So the French were definitely in this region in one way or another, either by intermarrying or by exploring. So the Chicago region emerged as a trading center in the late 1600s, and more Europeans began creating permanent settlements in the area too. So there was a French Catholic mission. There's some debate about exactly where it was located, but one theory is that it was located at the Indian Hill Golf Club in Winnetka, and that mission opened in 1696. Unfortunately, it was pretty quickly abandoned in the early 1700s. But Illinois, this was Pays d'Illinois, or Illinois country. It was also known as Upper Louisiana. And again, this region was important because it connected New France, so Quebec and Montreal, with Louisiana, so St. Louis and New Orleans. So there was a lot of movement and trade going on between those regions. Demand for furs was high across Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. The fur trade became a major economic activity for Native Americans and Europeans. The Europeans would trade goods, which I've listed here, for pelts, especially beaver pelts were extremely popular. So the fur traders, they often married indigenous women, and intermarriage ensured strategic commercial relationships. And the children of those marriages were known as Métis. And the Métis were important to the Great Lakes region for communication, for trade, for diplomacy. They usually spoke French and several indigenous languages. And many of the earliest families in the Chicago region would be Métis. So it seemed like this region was poised for continued French settlement and expansion in the 1700s, but that was interrupted by the Fox Wars. So during the early part of the 18th century, both European and native settlement virtually disappeared in our region. And that was because there was a lot of fighting between the French and the Sauk and Meskwaki, or the Sauk and Fox tribes. And that instability and the violence in the region meant no one wanted to settle here, and it really disrupted the fur trade. So that put a pause on everything here. There was actually a battle or a fight, something, a skirmish, whatever you want to call it, that actually happened at what the Glenview Club is now. It was between the Sauk and Meskwaki tribes and the French and their Miami allies. So there was actually fighting going on in this region at that time. But after a series of French victories in 1733, fur trading kind of began again, and the French were eventually successful in pushing the Sauk and Meskwaki tribes out of the region. If you remember from that first slide we looked at in 1750, the Sauk had been moved to the other side of the Mississippi by 1750. And with the Sauk moving out, that allowed the Potawatomi to come in. So the Potawatomi had been allied with the French during the Fox Wars. In the 1600s, they were living in upper Michigan and upper Wisconsin, but they were slowly moving south along Lake Michigan in the 1700s. So after the Fox Wars, they settled in northern Illinois. The Potawatomi, they're members of the Council of Three Fires, along with the Ojibwe and the Ottawa. So the Potawatomi, they were heavily involved in the fur trade. They developed close economic and familial ties with the French, and the French traders would often live amongst them in their villages. So they had the support of the French in settling in this area. The French believed that the Potawatomi would protect their interests in the fur trade if they controlled the Chicago waterways. So it was a mutually beneficial agreement for both parties. Unfortunately, the French were going to get kicked out soon. So things settled down here, but further east, you've got the French and Indian Wars happening in the mid-1700s. The French lose that war. So that war ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and the French lose their territories in North America. So Illinois, we become the British province of Quebec at that point. But French colonists continued to move into the area, or the descendants of French colonists move into the area. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, of course, in the 1780s, Antoine Wilmette, who founded Wilmette, or who Wilmette is named after, came in 1790. So there was still a French presence here. Just very briefly, since we are at the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, did you know that there were battles fought here in Illinois? We were the easternmost front of the westernmost front of the American Revolution. So it was all downstate. It was along the Kaskaskia River. But George Rogers Clark, he was a major in the Virginia militia, and he led the campaign, and he defeated the British and their indigenous allies. Because he was a Virginian, Virginia claimed us. So we suddenly became Illinois County, Virginia. So for a few years, we were Virginians. And then, of course, the war ends at the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783. Illinois officially becomes part of the United States. We actually become part of the Northwest Territory, which includes Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. So we're part of the Northwest Territory. The Illinois Territory is not established until 1809. So in the 18th century, there has not been a lot of British or American settlement in the region. And the end of the American Revolution does not immediately change that. And that's because of this proclamation of 1783. So right after the Treaty of Paris, the Continental Congress, they announced this proclamation. And basically it says that they do acknowledge that Native tribes have a right to the land, and that states, territories, individuals cannot purchase or settle on Native land without permission from the United States Congress. Now, Congress, the government, everyone assumes that the US government is going to acquire the land and turn it into real estate. That is what the government wants. But the government wants to be the ones brokering the deals between the Native tribes and controlling settlement in the new frontier. They don't want some random guy going up to the Potawatomi and saying, I will sell you this land. Give me all your land for $1. The government doesn't want that. The government wants to be the one controlling settlement and controlling those land deals. So that is why this area was not immediately opened up for settlement. So this area was known as Indian country, which basically means that we're beyond the area of Western settlement. So you do have some older French settlements in southern Illinois, but and that area is pretty well settled. Most of the indigenous populations they're sparser or they've moved out by this point. But northern Illinois is not open for settlement. It is still Potawatomi land. So you do have squatters sitting on land, and you do have Europeans or Americans living amongst Native tribes or establishing their own trading posts, like Point du Sable did at the Chicago River. And then, of course, there are the Métis, who are a class of people who would travel between Native and white settlements. But it was acknowledged that the land that we currently inhabit belonged to the Potawatomi. Mm-hmm. You can't hear me that well? Sorry. Okay. Okay. Is this a little bit better? I'll move it closer. Oop. Okay. All right. Sure. Okay. So yeah. All right. So this land belonged to the Potawatomi, essentially. Okay. So what did this area look like in 1800? We mostly know where the Potawatomi were settled and where their trails were because of the Scharf map. And this map was created in 1900 by Albert Scharf. He was a historian and amateur archaeologist. He worked with the Chicago Historical Society. And it details where the Potawatomi were living around 1804. So it's a huge map. This is just a portion of it. It shows all of Cook County, DuPage, and Will counties. It's a really cool map, and if you Google it, you can find it online and look at the whole thing, but I have zeroed in on Glenview, and I have colorized it a bit to make it a little bit easier to see. So the green are the trails, the yellow is the habitation, blue are rivers, right? So this green north-south trail, this is the Little Fort Trail. And this is Waukegan right now. So actually, I forgot to mention, I should show where we are. This is Glenview right here. You can see Glenview written there. But we are basically right here where the square is right now. So this Little Fort Trail, this is Waukegan Road. The diagonal, this is Milwaukee, which, as I said, Marquette and Joliet walked up at some point in the 1600s. But the east-west trail, this is Deer Trail. It was also known as Lake Trail. This is Glenview Road. And Glenview Road was really, well, Deer Trail, this trail was really important to the indigenous populations here. You can see it connects the Des Plaines River with both forks of the North Branch of the Chicago River, and it goes all the way to the lake and to the trails that run up and down the lake. And then it also connects all of these Potawatomi villages and camps. So there was a Potawatomi village. The big one was by where the Glenview Club is now. So that was the big camp or village in the area. There was another village by Oakton, and then there were more further south in Park Ridge. The biggest one was, this is the Forest Glen, Sauganash area down here, so northern Chicago. There was a small camp or a small village up where Wagner Farm is. So that's by Wagner Farm here. And then over here, there was a little camp. This was by the Glenview and Milwaukee, Glenview and Milwaukee intersection. This is kind of where the Grove is. And the Kinnecotts, who of course lived at the Grove, they actually helped make this map. So they knew exactly where the camps in some of these villages were from when they had first come here. So that's what Glenview looked like in 1804. A little bit more about the Potawatomi here. All of these trails would have been marked by trail marker trees. Here's an example of one that was in Deerfield in the early 1900s. But these trail marker trees, they were bent as saplings into a horizontal shape to the trail. And the trails marked exits and freshwater springs along the trail and where to cross the river. So in 1905 here in Glenview, there were still references to 2 or 3 trees along the North Branch near the Glenview Club. So they would have marked those trails to the village. There were others located by the Kinnecott homestead at the Grove. So along Milwaukee Avenue, they were there. The Potawatomi, they would have lived in bark wigwams or longhouses that held multiple families, so like the one here. We don't know how many Potawatomi were living in the villages in Glenview, but there is a French reference from the mid-1700s that noted that a village in the north suburbs, I don't know where, but it had about 150 longhouses in it. So these weren't small villages. There would have been quite a few families living together in these villages. This is an example of their agriculture. So this is how they laid out their fields. The Potawatomi actually had advanced agricultural practices. They grew crops, particularly wheat and corn, to feed their families, and to sell to fur traders and missionaries in the area. So they would trade fur for plows, for those French plows, and that allowed them to develop large plots of land in the Chicago region. So there's a myth that this area was prairie and marsh and wilderness, and it wasn't until the Americans showed up that we knew exactly how fertile this land was. That's not really true. Americans knew how fertile the land was because they could see what the Potawatomi were growing. And that was why the Americans wanted to come up here, because they knew that the land was fertile. Okay. So the beginning of American colonization in northern Illinois starts with the Treaty of Greenville. And this treaty officially ended the Northwest Indian War in the Ohio country. It basically became synonymous with the end of the American frontier in the eastern U.S. For us, it's important because the Potawatomi transferred land to the U.S. government at the mouth of the Chicago River. So the tribe began receiving annuities in exchange for that 6 square miles of land at Chicago. At the same time, several Potawatomi moved out of Michigan because they had given up land, and they began settling in northern Illinois. So at the same time that they were settling here, they were giving up land. There was just growing anti-American settlement among the indigenous population of the region. So with the Treaty of Greenville, Fort Dearborn was built at the mouth of the Chicago River in 1803, and it was meant to protect American fur interests and to serve as an official trading post, but it also was built as a defense against the local tribes. Relationships between the Potawatomi and the Americans began deteriorating in the early 1800s, and most Chicago Potawatomi, they sided with the English in the War of 1812. And during that war, federal troops, they abandoned Fort Dearborn. The Potawatomi seized the chance to attack the garrison. 50 Americans and 15 Potawatomi were killed. The Potawatomi attacked other American settlements in the region, but by 1814, they had begun to seek peace with the U.S. government. So Illinois becomes a state in 1818, and most European and American settlement has happened downstate. But now settlement is starting to expand. The Chicago region has been seen as vital for fur trading, but the area was now being eyed for its potential farmland. So there was a push for the U.S. government to allow for expansion into northern Illinois. So between 1815 and 1833, the Potawatomi would cede all of their lands to the U.S. They ceded their land that would become Glenview in 1829. And this was the result of warfare between the U.S. and tribes mostly around the Wisconsin and Illinois border. So the Potawatomi, so there was the Prairie du Chien, I'm sorry, I speak French and the Chien bothers me. The Prairie du Chien treaties, there were 3 of them. You can kind of see here, there was a treaty in, there was a treaty, there were 3 treaties in 1829. You can see there's 147, 149, and 148. The 148 is the second. This is the plot of land that was given up in the second treaty, and this is where Glenview is located. So you can see all of the land that was given up at that time. 187, plot 187, that was what was given up at the Treaty of Chicago. So with the Prairie du Chien treaty, the Potawatomi, they still had hunting rights to the land, and they could still have villages here. So they could still live here on the land, but it can now be surveyed for future American settlement. Also, as part of this treaty, various Potawatomi Indians were given land around the region. Among them, Antoine Wilmette, he had helped negotiate the treaty. And for recognition of the execution of that treaty, Wilmette's Potawatomi wife was given land in what is now Evanston and Wilmette. So shortly after this treaty is signed, he and his wife, their family, a few of their friends, they began settling on the coast in what's now Evanston and Wilmette. So that's the first kind of the recorded, anyway, European and American settlement in the region. Okay, but they're still fighting. So following the Black Hawk War in 1832, the government wants the fighting to stop in Illinois, and they want the land to be settled by Americans, and they want the native tribes out of the state. So in 1833, the Treaty of Chicago is signed. An estimated 3,000 Native Americans, land speculators, and government officials come to witness the negotiations. So the Treaty of Chicago, it is signed by the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. And they cede 5 million acres of land in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan to the U.S. government. So the treaty, this treaty was different from the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, because the Prairie du Chien treaty, they could still live here. But with the Treaty of Chicago, they were required to leave within 3 years. But they had to leave by 1837. They had to move west of the Mississippi. So the Potawatomi received annuities, the cancellation of debts, and specific territory for them west of the Mississippi. But they had to leave. So we know that not everybody left the region. The early settlers had stories of living amongst the Potawatomi, of trading with the Potawatomi, of just dealing with them on a somewhat daily basis. Throughout the 1800s, basically until the late 1800s, we know that there were still Potawatomi living in the region. So not everybody left. But with the Treaty of Chicago signed, land speculators, they were waiting at Fort Dearborn, and they were ready to buy land. So most of the early settlers in the Glenview area, anyway, were English. They purchased land for $1.25 an acre. And they could do an installment plan if they wanted, but they had to live on the land for at least 3 years if they wanted to do the installment plan. One of the people who bought land was Dardanus Bishop. This is one of his land records here. He bought land in what's now downtown Glenview. This is land that he bought himself, but he also had a partner, and the two of them bought quite a lot of land together. They eventually sold it at a markup. Of course, they were land speculators, so they were making money, which is what you expect. Other settlers who came here, they were American veterans. They were given land through the bounty land warrant system. They were veterans of the War of 1812. So they were given land in return for their service. And the prime land in Glenview was near those Potawatomi villages and near the Potawatomi trails, because they knew that that was high ground, and they knew that it was less likely to be marshy, and they knew that it was good for agriculture. In some instances, it may have already been cleared and ready for farms to go in. So in 1833, George and Anne Heslington, they arrive from England, and they basically go straight to Fort Dearborn, and they are there when the Treaty of Chicago is signed. They were one of those 3,000 people there waiting for land. As soon as the treaty is signed and they're able, they purchase 160 acres of land on what is today the Glenview Club. Anne's parents, the Dews family, they arrive in 1836, and sometime after that they built this log cabin. This cabin is pretty typical for housing for the early settlers in the area. It's got kind of a French colonial porch going on, which was pretty common at Fort Dearborn at the time. So the Heslingtons, they moved to Glenview Road, and the Dews family stays on the original property that George had purchased until the Glenview Club purchased it in the 1890s. This is one of this cabin here. It's one of the oldest structures in the area that still exists. It's at the 17th hole of the Glenview Club. They use it as a rain shelter, so it's still there. The Kinnecotts, though, everyone probably knows the Kinnecotts. They came in 1836. They came here from New Orleans, and they were actually squatting on their land on Milwaukee Avenue. So they were squatting on land near a Potawatomi camp. The land wasn't available for purchase yet, so the government had they had surveyed land, but they still hadn't made some of it available for purchase. And Dr. Kinnecott, he had family who had already settled in the area, and he came up to see them, and he started searching for land for himself, and he saw that land that would become the Grove, and he knew that that would be very suitable agricultural land for him, so they squatted on it until they were able to purchase it. As soon as the government did make that land available for sale, he purchased it, and he founded the Grove Nursery in 1842 with his 10-year-old son, Charles. And it became the first major nursery in northern Illinois. So in 1856, they had over 40 acres for their nursery, and their catalog that year stated that they were selling hundreds of different varieties of apples, pears, plums, cherries, peaches, and roses. So that's what they were growing at the Grove. This is John Kinnecott, but the house was built in 1856, and it still stands at the Grove today. So what did the area look like? Dr. Kinnecott described the region as being prairie, broken up by groves of oak trees. Other settlers mentioned maple and wild cherry trees lining the river. A 1919 article about Harm's Woods said that you could find the oldest trees in Cook County there. So the maple trees there were 400 to 1,000 years old. And they described, it was the densest maples in the area, and they described it as the forest primeval. So this was prairie, but there was also forested land here as well. And this became predominantly a farming community. Agriculture would play an important part in Glenview's early history. You had establishment of nurseries like the Grove. Most families had family farms. Then there were lumber yards. The farms mostly grew wheat, corn, beans, and squash. And then they had dairy cows, cattle, and hogs. I don't know whose farm this is, whose hogs these are, but here's a hog farmer, probably with a grove of trees, probably a little orchard there as well. They also harvested maple syrup in winter and early spring. We had all these maple trees, right? I also found a record for what the earliest settlers would hunt, just for some interest. Most of these animals, this would have been early 1800s. By the late 1800s, some of these animals wouldn't be here anymore, but in the early 1800s, they were hunting venison, raccoon, panther, bear, turkey, as well as swan, geese, crane, and every variety of duck. And this is what they were eating, right? So they were, I've never had panther meat, but that's what they were eating here. So this formidable lady, this is Sarah Hutchings, dear to my heart. Sarah and her husband James, they settled in the area in 1847. They purchased 120 acres of farmland for $7.50 an acre. So there's been quite a markup since 1833. That was about $37,000 in today's money. And they basically owned what's most of downtown Glenview. So they owned property from the North Shore Club all the way to Washington Street here. So the property that we're on now was Hutchings' land. Her husband, James, he decided to go make his fortune in the gold rush. So he left, and he actually died in Nicaragua in 1852. I see faces. People always look at me weird when I say he died in Nicaragua. It was faster to go down the Mississippi and then through the Gulf of Mexico, cross Central America, and then to get on a ship and go up the Pacific to get to California instead of going across the Rockies. So that's what people did. So James died. Sorry. And Sarah managed the property and the family businesses with her sons. So the family would play an important role in civic life in Glenview. Two of her sons fought in the Civil War. And when her oldest son, John Alexander, when he came back from the Civil War, they built this yellow farmhouse. It was built in 1864. It's at 1121 Waukegan Road. This is the oldest image we have of the farmhouse. It's a watercolor from 1917. But it's pretty typical of what it may have looked like in 1864. You can see the open porches. This farmhouse is still standing. It is the oldest house still standing in its original location in downtown Glenview. It's now the home in the History Center, which is why Sarah is special to me. But these open porches they've since been closed in. But yeah, we'll talk more about the Hutchings in a little bit. So as more settlers arrived in the 1840s, there was a need for schools. Miss Julia Grote, she was the first teacher. She made $1.50 a week for teaching at a cooper shop. I've also heard there was maybe a blacksmith shop, but it was not a school. But it was located on Waukegan Road, south of Glenview Road. So that's where the first school was. And that's actually the beginning of District 34, was in this cooper shop. Eventually that school moved onto Hutchings' family property. The Hutchings gave up some property for the school. It was located further north on Waukegan Road and became known as the Glenview School. That's about where the fire station on Waukegan Road is now. Dr. Kennicott, he also organized and gave land for one of the earliest schools in 1854, and that's the Grove School. That's the school that you can see here. There's a replica of this one-room schoolhouse at the Grove now, and those are our first two schools. So along with schools, we also had the beginnings of Glenview's first business district. So the intersection of Waukegan and Glenview Road, it's about a day's journey from Chicago in the 19th century. So it was a convenient stopping point for travelers. Sergeant Joseph Adams, he was one of those War of 1812 veterans who got a land bounty warrant. Yeah, anyway, he got land from the government for his service. The land that he got was on the southeast corner of this intersection. This is an old map that someone at the History Center had created at one point. You can see Waukegan Road here and Glenview Road. It was also called Lake Street. It didn't go straight across. It curved a little. It was straightened in the 1920s. But Sergeant Adams, his house was here. He built a cabin and he opened a store on that property all the way back in 1837. So that was our first store. In the 1860s, that property became the Hoffman House, which is the building next that you see here. And the Hoffman House, it had the first floor was a tavern, and the second and third floors were a hotel, and they had a large barn for travelers in the back. The northeast corner of the intersection, so about here, was William Hout's, which had a bar and a general store on the first floor, and then there was a large dance floor on the second floor. The Lie's Saloon was across the street. This was the Lie's Saloon. And there was also a bar, obviously. They were notable. They would cut ice from the river and store it in their saloon. And most of the settlers here would go to the river and cut ice this time of year. Tomorrow would be a good day to do that if you were going to do it now. But you would cut ice, and then that's how you would, keep your food fresh in the winter. All right. So Glenview and Waukegan Road, that's our first business district. It's very happening over there. We've got all our barns and taverns and dance halls here. Milwaukee Avenue on the west, it's more of a thoroughfare. It's a little quieter over there. There was a tri-weekly coach route on Milwaukee Avenue. It carried both passengers and mail. That route was established in 1836, and that mail route was very important because that was what kept the settlers informed, right? That's how they knew what was going on with the rest of the world. Milwaukee Avenue eventually became a plank road with tolls. It would cost $1.30 to travel between Chicago and Wheeling. That sounded like a lot of money to me when people are buying land for $1.25, so I actually looked it up. That's about $48 in today's money, so it was not a cheap road to travel, and it was supposedly not very comfortable either. The plank road was not, I don't know, it was very, very bumpy, and it was, even though it was a plank road, the planks would fall apart because it's wet and muddy here, so it wasn't great, but you were paying $48 to travel on it. This cottage, this is the Sweetum Stagecoach Tavern. People would stop here while traveling between Milwaukee and Chicago. I feel like every Illinois town has a place where Abe Lincoln is rumored to have stayed. This is Glenview's. He supposedly stayed here. I don't know when he would have been up here, but if he came here, this is where he stayed. It was the oldest continuously inhabited house in Cook County. So it was located on Milwaukee, just north of Central Avenue. There's a strip mall there now. But it was here until the early 2000s. So it lasted for a long time. So in the 1850s, German immigrants began settling in the area. So this is, and this marks the second big wave of immigration. So this is Johann and Katharina Wagner. They arrived around 1856, and they purchased land on the southeast corner of Lake and Wagner roads. So this is where the fire station is now. That's Wagner Farm. Their youngest son, Thomas, he purchased Hoffman Farm in 1902. And that is the Wagner Farm that we know today. So that property was owned by the Wagners since 1902, but the property across the street is the original homestead for the Wagners. Over here, we've got the Melzer family. This house was standing until very recently. It was located by Glenview and Greenwood roads. And the Melzers are still here and they're still active. They come by the History Center sometimes with artifacts, which is pretty cool. Other German immigrants that you would recognize just from names in the area, the Rugans, the Landwehrs, Shermers, Finkstons, they all came in the 1850s to this area. So the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, this was important to our region for a few reasons. One Glenview-related story is that the Melzer family, the family we just saw, Louisa Melzer, she sat on her rocking chair in October on her porch on Glenview Road, and she could read the newspaper that night by the light of the Chicago fire, supposedly. That's what they said. So it was supposedly quite bright. But a more immediate impact the fire that it would have on our community is that it caused the railroad to come in. So the Hutchings family donated land to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad for a train station. They laid rail through Glenview in 1871 to 72, and this was right after the Chicago fire. So the railroad bought brought lumber and building materials from communities such as Glenview into Chicago. They wanted to rebuild as fast as possible, and the fastest way to do that was to lay rail and bring those materials in by the railroad. So this was great for Chicago because it allowed other industries to grow along the railroad, such as tile and brick factories, dairy farms, truck farming. It kind of allowed all of that to grow. The first train depot, which is this one, was built in 1876. We first had this little shack here in 1872. This is the Clavey family. They were some of our oldest families here in Glenview as well. But the train depot was built in 1876. The railroad was double-tracked in 1892, just in time for the Columbian Exposition, so you could now bring people to and from Chicago. And the railroad fundamentally changed Glenview from a farming community into a commuter suburb, especially that double-tracked. This allowed older family farms, this allowed people to commute into the city. So older family farms would soon be subdivided into housing, to be used for nurseries or to be turned into businesses. So this is around the time that we start talking about the name of Glenview. So our official names were South Northfield, because we are the southern part of Northfield Township. That's what we were first called. And then sometime around the 1860s, 1870s, we started going by Oak Glen. When they put in the railroad, there was another train station called Oak Glen. So you could not have two Oak Glens on the rail line. So we had to come up with a new name. Because the Hutchings had given the land, they wanted to say, well, we'll call the train station Hutchings. Sarah Hutchings did not want that. She thought it was crass. She did not want her name on the train station, so it was not Hutchings. They put the name Barr, B-A-R-R, on the train station. That was not the community's name. That was just the name of the train station. It was named after a railroad executive or something. But yeah, so we were the Barr train stop for a while. It wasn't until the 1890s that we finally adapted Glenview. And there is some debate over whether it's one word or two words. It went back and forth for a while. It wasn't until about the 1920s that we settled on one word, Glenview. But these were a few other names that were considered. Glen was obviously a big choice here. But yeah, and then Rugenville. Okay. So yeah, we're not a dry community here. A lot of our earliest businesses were saloons and taverns. This is Glenview House over here. It was built in 1878, anecdotally by John Dews, descendant of one of the original families, the Dews family. By the 1890s, it was known as Al Eustace's Saloon. Eventually, it was purchased by John Dilg, and Dilg put this third story on in the early 20th century. It burned down in the 1920s, and they never replaced it. But by the 1890s, there was lodging on the second floor and a tavern on the first. It was in the saloon that our area leaders met to vote to incorporate our village. In the 1900s, the local court and the Catholic services were held there. This was the first Catholic church. Glenview House also served as temporary classrooms. When the Glenview School became too crowded, the tavern was also home to a dancing hall that was on the third floor, a Masonic lodge, a barber shop, and of course the brothel. So there was everything there. The second building, which also still stands, which you might recognize, H.L. Harms, he built this building in 1889. Leo Lang turned it into a saloon in 1902, and it has operated as a bar ever since, even during Prohibition. It was a bar. So it is our oldest continuously running bar in town. This is Grandpa's, of course. So you can go have a beer and say you're celebrating history. Our other early industries, the Hutchings family had a lot of industries. These are some Hutchings family businesses. They had a sawmill, a saw and grist mill. It was located across from their farmhouse. So this is the site of Scott Funeral Chapels. That's where the grist mill was. After the Civil War, John Hutchings, he introduced steam power to the mill. This was the first use of steam power in Northfield Township. The mill closed in 1892. In 1880, his brother William, he built a general store on what's now Glenview Road. He sold that business to C.D. Rugen and H.B. Appleyard in 1892. That business grew into Rugen Stores, which if you grew up in Glenview or lived here for a while, you would have known Rugen Stores. It's just basically right across the street here, well, across the railroad track here from the library. And it was a community staple until 1980. So after selling the general store, William Hutchings, he purchased a tile factory north of the railroad, which was one of the many industries located along the tracks. A couple of other industries that were really popular by the train tracks. So the railroad was, of course, using lumber and building supplies to Chicago since the fire. But these two companies, they were established by around the turn of the century. The Pearson Lumber Company, up here, it later became E. Hines Lumber Company, which operated for a long time north of the train station. And then the Letter Brick Company. They operated a brickyard at Chestnut and the railroad tracks. And they became the third largest brick maker in Chicago. Their cream-colored brick was a popular choice for housing facades. So all those cream-colored houses were, well, the cream-colored bricks, most of them were built, the bricks themselves were made up here in Glenview. Then you've had nurseries, of course, because we're still agricultural, right? So Swain Nelson and his wife Sophie, they started a landscaping business in Chicago in 1856. Originally from Sweden, Nelson became a well-known landscape architect. He designed parks in Chicago, including Lincoln Park, which he designed in 1865. In 1893, Swain Nelson established his nursery on 200 acres on the north side of Glenview Road. He moved here because he recognized the agricultural suitability of the area. And his nursery business was a huge employer in the village. It prompted other nurseries to open up in Glenview. And so like nurseries, landscaping companies, garden centers, these would become the major industry in the area for the first half of the 20th century. And you can even notice down here in small print, it says Glenview, Illinois, Chicago's garden suburb. So it's kind of what we were known for a while. So most of the earliest settlers, they would meet in homes for religious meetings, and sometimes businesses would host circuit riding preachers. But these were the earliest churches that were built in in Glenview. The Methodist congregation, they began meeting regularly in 1860, but they built this church on Church Street in 1885. So Church Street now is, of course, home to OLPH, Our Lady of Perpetual Help. But the Church Street is actually named for the Methodist Church, which was located right in the middle of what is now that OLPH campus. The Methodist Church would sell that property to the Catholic Church in the 1950s when they moved to what is that street? The street right here, Lehigh, that just turns into Harlem. Thank you. The Evangelical Emmanuel Lutheran Church, they organized a church and a school in 1876, and their church was dedicated in 1886, and they're located on what's now Chestnut Avenue. Their school was the first private school in Glenview. So the area Catholics would have to travel to Wilmette for Mass until 1906. Lots of others would travel to Skokie and Niles and Northbrook to go to church as well. So the last wave of immigration to this area in the 1800s are the Swedenborgians, and they arrive in the 1890s. These are members of the Church of New Jerusalem, so they're followers of the theologian Emanuel Swedenborg. They had a large community in Chicago, but they wanted to leave the city. They wanted clean air, gardens, trees. They wanted to create a planned community out in the country, so they chose Glenview. For their community. And this development became known as the Park. So the park is located on just down Glenview Road at Glenview and Shermer. It still exists. It's a nice little planned community. Swain Nelson, he did the landscaping down there. But many of Glenview's most prominent and earliest businessmen, they lived in the park, such as Hugh Burnham. He was the nephew of Daniel Burnham from the Columbian Exposition. He became our first mayor. or first village president. This house down here, this was Daniel Burnham's house. It was torn down in the early 2000s. This is their church, which still exists there. All right, so with more residents moving into the area in the 1890s, it became apparent that they needed more services than what the county or the township could provide. Most notably, they wanted sidewalks. I don't know how well you can see in this photo, but this is Pine Street, looking north, and it's just mud if you look at it. The street here is just very muddy. There's no sidewalk here. It's just mud. Some of the people, they have had to put down plank roads over this ditch here. When they describe it, they just describe it as mud. And you've got people who are commuting into the city. They have to walk from their homes to the train station. They're getting muddy. The women's dresses are getting muddy. Nobody likes it. They want a city. They want sidewalks. That is the big complaint when you read the articles, is that they want sidewalks. So there was a referendum in 1898 to incorporate that failed. But there was a second referendum on June 17th, 1899, which passed 59 votes to 51 votes. The estimated population of the village was 351 at the time. So we officially incorporated on June 20th, 1899. That referendum was held in what is now the Glenview House. So the area saw a lot of change from 1800 to 1899. We've continued to grow. This is the first boundaries of the town to where we are now. But yeah, we've grown from a town of 351 to a village of over 48,000 people in all of that time.